This video is sponsored by Incogni. Stick around to find out more.
In the year 407, the Emperor Constantine III led the last few Roman troops from these islands. The empire that had constructed this remarkable wall had crumbled in Britain. Now, history books tell us that when the Romans pulled out, they took with them all vestiges of civilization and effectively turned out the lights. The country then plunged into centuries of cultural and economic chaos, known as the Dark Ages. Now, all of this would be fine were it not complete rubbish. As an archaeologist, I've spent my career exploring Britain's ancient past, and I now believe we've misunderstood the earliest centuries of this country's history. Instead of a nation crushed and then created by invaders, I've found a strong society with a unique and lasting culture. The Roman colonization is supposed to have erased the ancient Britons and instigated a troubled period dominated by invasions from superior civilizations. A period whose only hero was a mythical one, the legendary King Arthur, valiantly fighting the invading hordes. But I don't believe our ancient culture was overwhelmed as easily as that. I'm determined to examine what really happened in this country after the Romans invaded. I'm going to embark on an archaeological journey to uncover hard evidence for the story of Britain in the first centuries of its recorded history, the story of Britain AD.
King Arthur would fight to keep his kingdom safe, so why aren't you? Every day your personal data comes under threat when browsing the internet. But now there's something you can do about it. That's why we're excited to share this video's sponsor, Incogni. Incogni specialises in removing your personal data from the internet, keeping it out of the hands of data brokers. By tirelessly monitoring these platforms and submitting ongoing removal requests, Incogni helps protect your privacy and minimise potential threats. You know the feeling of receiving spam calls and emails, and wondering how they got your number in the first place? The answer is data brokers, who sell your information online to the highest bidder. With your data for sale, this exposes you to scams if bought by the wrong people, and you could even be denied loans as a result. Or if you're in the US, there are people search sites which list details like license plates, making you very easy to find. Trying to remove this data yourself can be extremely difficult, so make Incogni a knight at your round table and let them protect your personal data once and for all. And if after 30 days you don't like what you get, you can get your money back with Incogni's 30-day money-back guarantee. Take your personal data back with Incogni. Use code AbsoluteHistory at the link below and get 60% off an annual plan at incogni.com/absolutehistory.
Using the latest archaeological research, I'm going to tell the real story of Britain from the perspective of the men and women who lived on this island during this period. And I'm going to start with the first chapter of Britain AD, the Roman occupation of Britain. This peaceful corner of Somerset is the site of one of Britain's earliest and bloodiest battles, and is evidence for the crushing of our ancestors in the early years of Britain AD. For hundreds of years before the Roman conquest, this dramatic hill fort was a religious centre for the ancient Britons. When the Roman conquerors arrived, the people up here were ready for them. The banks on the side of the hill are the remains of ramparts that would have stood 5 meters high. But the hill fort was not designed to face the disciplined might of the Roman army. The defenders were driven back and the gates set alight. The Roman troops stormed through the burning gateway and slaughtered the Britons. Men, women and children were cut down and their bodies left to rot where they fell. After this massacre, the Roman troops destroyed fields and farmland, a clear message to the Britons not to mess with the might of Rome. The events at Cadbury Castle tell a familiar story of the native Britons as tragic victims. It's a story that fits well into the conventional narrative of Britain AD. I'm going to show that this version of our past is wrong. The first few centuries of Britain AD saw the forging of our national identity. Archaeology is beginning to show that far from a dark age, this was a time of huge creativity and development. Until now, the legacy of Roman Britain has blocked our understanding of this period. In order to appreciate the significance of these times, we must go back to the archaeology. The archaeologists who excavated here at Cadbury Castle didn't only find evidence of a Roman massacre, they also came across building foundations that dated to soon after the Roman occupation. This confirmed what I'd thought, that ancient British culture was strong. But there's a final twist. The archaeologists had been looking for Arthur's Camelot.
The locals actually believed that this was Camelot. They'd been ploughing this field. They were coming up with all sorts of materials, most of it Iron Age with a bit of Roman stuff coming up, but they thought it was the site of a battle, really.
Yeah.
And then relatively small-scale excavation comes across massive refurbishment of the fortifications in roughly the right period, comes across a timber-framed hall in the middle with loads and loads of Mediterranean-type pottery scattered about. The fact that there is already a connection with Arthur's name means that the whole thing is ready to roll.
Could Arthur be a clue to what happened in Britain AD? The problem is that Arthurian archaeology is more than a little short of evidence. There isn't a corner of Britain that doesn't claim a connection with this historical celebrity. And this is where Arthur's supposed to have been conceived. And this is Arthur's footprint. This is Bassini Mound. King Arthur's Round Table is buried here. And every year, on Midsummer's Day, it levitates. And this is Arthur's Camelot. This is Slaughter Bridge, where Arthur finally kicked the bucket before being carted off to Avalon. As an archaeologist, I've always been rather skeptical of the Arthurian industry. Arthur is the ultimate commodity, a ready-made hero who's been hijacked by history. And in this dramatic visitor attraction high in the Shropshire countryside, there's a complete Arthurian package. There's a deep lake with a legend of a sword Excalibur, and I'm standing in Arthur's grotto, where someone claims they found the Holy Grail. There was even a stone with a sword in it until somebody nicked the sword.
Arthur encapsulates so many good qualities that we really want to identify with. Arthur's the great warrior figure, and he'll come back to save us when the nation is in its greatest peril. And that sort of story has an enormous attraction.
This gripping tale of Dark Age Britain has fired the imagination of writers and artists for centuries, and it would be easy to dismiss it as a fairy tale with no grounding in historical reality. But myths are not necessarily lies. Stripped of his medieval embellishments, Arthur has new things to tell us about this period. The idea of noble Arthur conflicts with the conventional view of the barbaric Dark Ages and supports my view that British culture survived the Romans intact. And at the heart of Arthur's story, I found a clue to the resilience of the native Britons in the aftermath of Roman rule. The myth of the sword Excalibur holds a clue to what really happened in Britain AD. The story of King Arthur is not a happy one. The tale involves an illegitimate boy who is raised by a magician called Merlin. The boy becomes king and assembles a loyal following of 12 men known as the Knights of the Round Table. King Arthur and his knights fight many gallant battles, but eventually Arthur is killed. His body is taken to the magical island of Avalon, where legend has it Arthur is not dead but sleeping, waiting for a time when his kingdom will need him again. Throughout the many different versions of this story, there is a potent image that comes back again and again. Swords play a central role in the Arthurian legends. He learns that he is to be king of Britain when he miraculously withdraws a sword from a stone. At the end of his life, his magical sword Excalibur is returned to a goddess in a lake. As a prehistorian, these stories sent a shiver of recognition down my spine. The image of Arthur pulling his sword out of a stone was an eerie reminder of the ancient practice of casting bronze. I have witnessed this process. The orange glowing sword is actually pulled from a stone mould. In my work as a prehistorian, I had discovered ritual traditions in which weapons were disposed of in watery places and where islands had particular potency. How did these ancient British traditions find their way into the story of King Arthur, written centuries later? The answer lies just north of the Fens in a region known as the Witham Valley. In 1981, archaeologists digging here came across a remarkable discovery. Just under the surface of the fen, a series of upright posts and horizontal timbers were uncovered. They form part of a raised causeway constructed over 2,000 years ago. At either side of this causeway, archaeologists found dozens of pieces of ancient weaponry, including a large number of swords and spears. And this was not the first time that such objects had been found here.
In the late 18th century, when they were dredging the Witham, Sir Joseph Banks, a great scientist and collector, put out a notice to the workmen to say, anybody finds anything, you come to me, I'll see you all right. And it was a wonderful thing to do because this stuff wouldn't have found its way into the museums if that hadn't happened.
Over the years, literally hundreds of swords, daggers, and other precious items have been dredged from the fens here. They range in date from the prehistoric period right through to the 14th century. Now, this wasn't some localized Fenland cult, but part of a much larger belief system. They're still being found today.
We've been out here every weekend, more or less, since August, and look at how many people have turned up. They've walked a lot of their parish already. They've found some fantastic sites over there, of course, just through field walking. If they hadn't done it, we'd never know about them. Although individually you might not have thought that you're finding very much, but put all together we've found nearly 2,000 separate objects now.
In And that's an Iron Age axe, part of the shaft still there.
Again, you so rarely see them.
1858.
That's a Viking axe and a made for splitting heads.
This extraordinary, complete Iron Age spear shaft.
It's the longest in Europe. Medieval iron swords. A masterpiece. The Witham shield's not really useful as a shield. As with much of this, it's a ritual piece. Although we find weapons, we're finding tools as well. The great and the good and the everyday people, I think, coming together in this activity.
It wasn't until recently that archaeologists began to notice a pattern in the location of these objects.
Throughout the valley, there are these slightly higher sandbanks and ridges.
These were the remains of ancient causeways, which once formed part of this extraordinary landscape. The Witham Valley stretches in a long, thin line up to the city of Lincoln. Until these fens were drained in the 1780s, the Witham would have sprawled all over the low-lying land, weaving a network of islands and marshes. Local people moved around the fens on a series of wooden causeways. The weapons were always discovered near these causeways. At first it was assumed they were accidentally dropped or lost in battle. In fact, there is a far more mysterious explanation.
People were visiting the river, using the river, and for whatever reason, they were leaving this sort of material. The spear could have been used in the river, but it seems to have been given to the river.
And I like the idea of them being given and returned to the waters, perhaps.
And these medieval iron swords, well, the sword theme does actually go all the way through millennia.
For hundreds of years, weapons have been deliberately thrown from these causeways into the water. I believe that the story of King Arthur receiving his sword Excalibur from the Lady of the Lake is a direct reference to this ancient British tradition. But the Arthurian legends were written much later, long after these ancient religious ideas were supposedly wiped out by the Romans and Christianity. How on earth did they survive? The Witham had one more secret to reveal. This area of Fenland has one of the highest concentrations of monastic sites anywhere in Britain. There can be no practical need for so many abbeys in such a small area. So why was the early medieval church building here with such extraordinary fervour? The narrow 10-mile stretch of the Witham Valley is scattered with the remains of 14 abbeys. Every one of these abbeys is built at the end of an ancient causeway.
We found it really difficult to understand why there should be 14 church sites, all lined up for 10 miles along the edge of the Witham Valley.
Historians Dave Stocker and Paul Everson don't think that this is a coincidence.
The abbey we are standing on is on an island. You find there's only one way to get here, and it's along a causeway.
It seems odd that a causeway should determine where you're going to put an abbey.
You've got to bear in mind that to cross any sort of body of water, but particularly to cross a fen by boat, was a dangerous matter. And in order to make it a successful crossing, you had to offer some sort of piety. Some sort of, call it superstition, but it was a sort of folk superstition which was bound up with religion.
The weapons and the water into which they were being placed had significance for the people of ancient Britain.
Swords weren't just a weapon. The sword is a great symbol of authority, which is distributed outwards from lords to their tenants as a badge of office. Once the tenant dies, that sword has to go back to the lord, and that's attested in many Anglo-Saxon wills. Now, imagine that you're a king and you haven't got a lord, or at least not on earth. And in the Arthur story, of course, it's the Spirit of the Lake, it's the Lady of the Lake, who is the guardian of Britain.
The story of the Lady in the Lake echoes the ancient tradition of depositing weapons in water. The medieval authors who wrote these tales knew about such traditions because Christianity had not killed them off, but had kept them alive.
When were the last swords going in? Well, the latest one is 14th century. And interestingly enough, that's precisely the same moment at which swords and indeed whole body armour tend to start being hung up in churches over burials of lords.
I mean, it sounds to me, looking at it as a prehistorian, that actually what some of these chaps in the abbeys are doing sounds awfully sort of pagan to me.
Pope Gregory has said, I don't want you knocking down these pagan temples, I want you converting the pagan idols. Water is the one connecting thread. The Bronze Age barrows were by the water. The causeways crossed the water. The swords are put into the water. So the one connecting thread of all this is water.
And do you suppose that might be a reason why that fantastic cathedral over there is placed right by the River Witham?
I have very little doubt that that's the case. The first name for Lincoln is Indo-Colne, city by the pool. Nicor is what the Normans tended to call the place. And the word Nicor means water spirit.
The story of the Witham is one of continuity. It suggests that deep-rooted ideas that began in prehistory continued well into the medieval period. This clashes with what I learnt at school, where the first 1,000 years of British history were a series of massive invasions. Indeed, the first of these, the Roman invasion, may not have been a forced invasion at all. At the heart of a tale about a boy and a magical sword, I found evidence that ancient British traditions survived the Roman invasion. A new series of archaeological discoveries are beginning to rewrite the story of the Roman invasion of Britain. This elegant mosaic decorated the floor of one of the most luxurious buildings in Roman Britain. But this was not the overseas residence of some extravagant Roman governor, but the home of a wealthy, Romanized Brit. Fishborn Palace is the largest building ever excavated in Roman Britain. Martin Hennig helped excavate the gardens.
It was absolutely amazing. Digging along, your trowel couldn't help sinking in, and you were actually uncovering the bedding trenches, probably for box. You can see similar gardens on a much smaller scale if you go to Pompeii.
On a smaller scale?
Yes. What you've got here is something that's equivalent to the palaces of the greatest Roman aristocrats.
Fishborn covers a larger area than Buckingham Palace. 160 stone columns support the roof, which is constructed from 100 tons of imported Italian tiles. Corridors surround over 100 rooms, some of which are decorated with elaborate mosaics. When Fishborn was discovered, it was assumed that this was the palace of a Roman governor, a symbol of the imperial regime that had been forced on Britain. But during excavations, archaeologists came across a gold signet ring with an unusual inscription, the seal of Tiberius Claudius Catuarus. The ring belonged to a wealthy Briton. But what was it doing at Fishborn? To understand why a Briton might be living in a Roman palace, we must look again at the events leading up to the invasion of AD 43. Maybe because we haven't been invaded since 1066, we British have a simplistic attitude towards invasions. We see them as being inevitably oppressive. So we imagine that when the Romans arrived, they wiped out British culture and customs. But in actual fact, it wasn't a straightforward process of colonization. Archaeologists are starting to radically rethink the Roman invasion of Britain. I would imagine the Britons faced by the might of Rome would have been quaking in their boots.
I don't think it was quite that. The previous attempt to invade Britain was that of the bad and mad Emperor Caligula, who had marched a large army up to the Channel coast. He then put all his catapults in a row, and they fired enormous rocks into the sea. After a time, he told them that he had won a great victory over Nection. You can imagine how that got about. The great Roman Empire was run by a lot of Charlies, and it completely destabilized the situation, of course.
Pre-Roman Britain was, in fact, a collection of often feuding tribal kingdoms. There is very little written evidence about early British tribes, but John Crichton showed me a burial from the period which contained some intriguing items.
Lexington Tomb List is a burial found just outside Colchester. Dates to about 10 BC, so this is still about 50, 60 years before the Roman conquest. Containers of Roman wine, small little Cupid, bronze work coming in from the Italian world. This stuff just isn't being produced in Britain at all. Here's a small little medallion of the Roman emperor, the Emperor Augustus. So a really nice personal gift from the emperor.
But why would an Iron Age king in Britain want to have a Roman emperor's head in his grave?
They're associating themselves with Rome. It's like all the satellite states around the Soviet Union or the influence America had in Central America. Big, powerful empires have very, very close relations with all the states around them.
Certain tribal leaders in Britain had been friendly with Rome for decades before the invasion. Their coins reflect the glory of the empire.
Coinage is never politically neutral. It's always saying something, it's always meaning something. It has its own native style to start with. But then, around about the time of this kind of burial, we start finding classical imagery appearing on the coins.
So they would have been familiar with classical literature?
Certainly the upper tier, yes. And that can't be a coincidence. The kings in Britain are very tightly bound in with the power politics in Rome. We see them adopting the same imagery, again, showing their affiliation to the New World Order.
There was one British king known as Verica, who was on particularly good terms with Rome. His tribe was the Atrebates. In the most complete version of the Roman invasion, the historian Cassius Dio describes Verica inviting the Roman troops in.
A certain Verica had persuaded the Emperor Claudius to send a force to Britain, led by the distinguished Senator Plautius.
This wasn't a subservient relationship. Verica would help the Romans if he was able to do so, and that they would help him if need be.
In AD 43, the need did arise when Verica's kingdom was invaded.
The Atrebates had been effectively under military occupation by tribes from the north.
That rather implies that, to people down here at least, the Romans weren't that unwelcome.
The Romans arrived as liberators.
This is a revolutionary idea, but can it be supported by archaeology? Cassius Dio on the invasion.
On the way across, they were first discouraged, but they recovered when they saw a flash of light cross the sky from east to west, the direction they were traveling. When the fleet reached the island, there was no one to oppose them.
Dio, however, omits to mention where the invasion took place. Why was I taught as a student that the Romans landed in large numbers on the Kentish shore at Richborough?
There had been excavations at Richborough which certainly discovered some early military evidence. They looked at the 3rd century account and added topographical details so that a battle on the Medway became almost a historical fact, though actually the River Medway is nowhere mentioned.
So archaeologists invented it?
Yes, it's a total invention.
If the Romans didn't arrive at Richborough, where did they land? There is another possible site for the Roman invasion. Chichester Harbour, slap bang in the middle of Vereker's territory. This is a fairly typical tidal creek. What makes it special?
It's nice and sheltered, a wonderful natural harbour, which would have allowed large numbers of men to be disembarked.
Yes. If you had a Roman invasion arriving here, what sort of number of boats?
Perhaps 200 or 300.
Yeah.
So a large number of boats that would need to be manoeuvred.
Chichester Harbour is in fact right next to Fishborn Palace. So was the palace anything to do with King Vereker? The palace was built 30 years after the invasion. However, recent finds of ceramics have revealed that there was a base at Fishborn before the invasion. John Manley was involved in the excavations.
The fact that we found these kind of ceramics and food remains suggests it was a heavily Romanized place before AD 43. To my mind, it makes it much more likely that a large part of the invasion force landed here in territory that they were familiar with, maybe in territory where they already had client kings. It was Vereker who pleaded with the Romans to come to Britain. And Vereker lived somewhere around here, Chichester Fishborn area, and that was used as a pretext for the invasion of Britain. Now, we don't hear of Vereker again after AD 41, so it is conceivable his relative, maybe even his son, was brought in by the incoming Romans and settled here as a client king.
Although we can't be certain, Vereker's son was probably called Togidubnus. Excavations at Fishborn found the marble bust of a child. Was this the owner of the palace?
The marble head has to have been carved in Rome. There was no marble carving in Britain. It's very likely that of Togidubnus at the time he was made a Roman citizen.
Do you think Togidubnus himself would have lived here at Fishborn?
I think almost undoubtedly he did. It's an enormous palace. This must have been something of a power centre for King Togidubnus, who was increasingly given territories and authority to rule much of the rest of the province.
This contradicts the conventional account of the Roman conquest. King Vereker opened his doors to the Roman troops who sailed peacefully up Chichester Harbour. In honour of this new alliance, the most splendid palace was built not as a symbol of Roman suppression, but as a celebration of British tribal power. The Romans claim that they came, saw and conquered, but in actual fact they were invited into this country. Once here, they didn't crush our native culture, but guided the development of an increasingly diverse society. In the years after the invasion, the Romans built a series of towns across Britain. Perhaps most opulent of these was Bath. The buildings here typify the elegance and the glory of the Roman Empire. The town was built on the site of an ancient spring, which had been a religious site for thousands of years.
It's a great natural phenomenon. 250,000 gallons of water a day just pours out of the ground. It's hot, it's 40-odd degrees centigrade.
Barry Cunliffe excavated the baths in the 1970s.
Within 30 years of the invasion, they were putting up this great monument. And the first job was to contain the spring. It was a pretty impressive piece of engineering because of that water coming out all the time. You could take one view. Here are the Romans who've come to this place and they've imposed this great Roman building, slapped it down on the landscape. And this could be seen as a sort of imperialism. But I don't think it's like that at all. What we're seeing here is the Romans being very, very sensitive to the sanctity of the place. They recognize it as a sacred place. They appreciate it as a sacred place. Although the buildings are Roman and the sculptures look Roman, the iconography, I think, is hinting at something that goes right back into the Iron Age. When we excavated in the temple precinct, we were able to work out there was a real order about it. Facing east with the great Gorgon's head was the temple front itself. And then on either side, there were two sculptured facades with pediments. On the north side, the pediment had the goddess Luna in it, who was shown riding her chariot across the night sky. On the southern side was a pediment with a god of the sun, Sol, with a spiky crown. So you've got a sort of sense of north cold, south hot. The south side presiding over the hot spring. And the balance between the goddess and the god, the male-female. This encapsulates a much earlier belief. So the Romans are, if you like, taking over the sacred geography of the place and are monumentalizing that.
Many objects were thrown into the sacred spring as offerings. This is a startling reminder of the age-old customs in the Witham Valley and the Arthurian story of the Lady of the Lake.
The spring is a fissure going down into the underworld where the deities lived, so you could communicate there. This, we know from the Roman period, was sacred to Sulis Minerva, the two words put together. Now, Minerva, of course, is the Roman goddess. And Sulis is presumably the Iron Age goddess, the person revered here going right back in time. The earliest occupation is Mesolithic, going back to 7,000 BC. People will always have revered it. You can imagine what it would have looked like at the time of the Roman conquest. The water brings up iron oxide, and that would have spread red crusts around on this black mud. And it must have looked almost as though the ground was bleeding.
The construction of these baths is a magnificent feat of engineering for which the Romans are quite rightly admired. Although they gave us magnificent buildings and luxurious baths, I do not believe that the Romans fundamentally changed this country's soul. Through the years of Roman occupation, Britain developed a unique ability to absorb foreign influences without losing its own identity. But the biggest foreign influence had yet to arrive. It originated not in Rome, but in the Holy Lands of Jerusalem, and it would contribute to the fall of the empire in Britain. It's long been assumed that having forced themselves on Britain, the Romans abandoned this insignificant island to deal with more pressing problems at home. However, I don't believe this was the case. This vast lead tank has been restored to its original state. But when I first saw it, I was crammed at the bottom of a Roman well, and the tank lay there like a crumpled milk carton. I remember thinking, why on earth didn't they melt it down and reuse this valuable lead? Why dispose of it in this deliberate fashion? What was so special about this tank? The tank is decorated with a symbol which combines the Greek letters chi and rho, which is a sign of very early Christian worship. This is Constantine the Great. Near this spot in July 306, he was made Emperor of Rome. He later went on to make Christianity the official religion of the Roman Empire. It was a time of immense political change that foreshadowed the ultimate collapse of the Roman Empire in the West. By encouraging Christianity in Britain, Constantine gave his subjects something that would become more powerful than Rome itself. Constantine's conversion came towards the end of the Roman occupation of Britain, by which time the structure of society had begun to change.
During the late 3rd century and on into the 4th, the super rich stopped spending their money on public buildings for the benefit of the population in general. They spent it on themselves. The big money moves out of the towns. It's a pattern we've seen in our own time. Wealthy people tend to take their money out to their country estates. The great villas were just scattered throughout southern Britain. There we have these people right out on the fringe of the Roman world, aping a classical world from hundreds of years ago. These people were sticking references to classical mythology and classical literature on the floors in their houses.
These mosaics hold a key to the way in which beliefs in Britain changed. Chedworth Villa in Gloucestershire was one of the richest of these country houses. Phil Bethel showed me around.
This was one of probably the top 10 richest, most opulent houses in the whole of Britain in the 4th century. All along the length of this corridor, there would have been a continuous mosaic floor, nearly 80 metres long. So they had everything that money at that time could buy. Mosaics in every room, underfloor heating systems, 2 bathhouses, their very own in-house water shrine. This whole thing was designed to show you I'm rich and I'm powerful. So this was actually a little temple, and here was actually part of their daily religion where they'd worship in time-honoured fashion, going back to the Celtic origins of the Romano-British religion, but they'd worship the spirit of the spring. They seem to have almost recreated a bit of their earlier cultural history. The idea that this was a Roman from Rome living here seems a bit unlikely. The Roman Empire, it was a bit like a sort of a franchise. You know, they opened a branch of Rome out here in Britain, and the people who actually did the day-to-day governing and running of the country were by and large natives. It would, in this case, would have been native Britons, but from the families that were probably already important before the Romans came. It seems in Gloucestershire there wasn't a big conquest here. The local tribe, the Dobuni, seemed to play along with the Romans when they invaded. That may be why it became a very wealthy area. Rich, powerful people who lived here already took advantage of that new system to increase their wealth.
Some of the mosaics that covered the floor of Chedworth Villa have been destroyed. But many British mosaics have been preserved in architectural drawings. From a society who didn't leave many written records, these mosaics are a unique insight into the complex minds of the Romano Brits and the beliefs that changed their world. Some of these mosaics contain a strange mixture of Christian and pagan symbols, which have long been dismissed as clumsy mistakes. But in actual fact, these images are connected to the mystery of a lead tank.
I think that we ought to look at mosaic pavements in much the same way one would look at stained glass windows in churches. When you go to Chartres and look at the glorious stained glass windows in a Gothic church, each image up there says something. We have to see this as being a literate society, a learned society, elite members of society with quite a lot of time on their hands who were interested in reading the classics and the literature, and they are trying to make sense of the world they live in.
At Lullingston Roman Villa, the discovery of a converted chapel was evidence that Christianity had been practiced here. Within the mosaics, Dominic Perring has found a sign that the people here were dealing in a very unusual Christian cult called Gnosticism.
4th century is a period of vigorous intellectual ferment. And whereas today we have a strong idea about science as leading us forward, then it was very clearly philosophy. People were trying to escape the mortal condition, this prison of our world. To escape, it was about knowing the secrets. It was about knowing how to move into a higher plane of existence. And knowledge was very much part of that. Knowledge of the images, knowledge of mythology, knowledge of philosophy, knowledge of Christ, but also secret knowledges.
Hidden in the mosaics, Dominic has found Gnostic images which blend classical myths with the Christian ideas about immortality. This strange fusion of beliefs was at the heart of the Gnostic cult. It may have become a symbol of Romano-British culture.
Bellerophon is slaying a monster. He's riding winged Pegasus. The message here is both good slaying evil, but also the attempt to reach life immortal. It certainly was a set of beliefs which lent itself to urban, aristocratic, elite society and villa society. These were people who were able to engage in these arcane discussions, these philosophical debates.
Such independent thinking could not be tolerated by the empire, and in 380, the emperor denounced Gnosticism as heresy.
The emperor establishes edicts against heresies, and you're allowed to exile people, confiscate their lands and whatever. How does one stop heretics being heretics? Well, stop them baptizing. If a bishop can't baptize a flock, you don't increase the size of the flock. So destruction of baptismal fonts is one way of doing it. We've got archaeological evidence of damaged lead tanks, some of which quite clearly were used for baptism, which are being cut into pieces and thrown down wells.
The crumpled baptism tank that I had seen was just one of many Christian items which had been deliberately destroyed or buried in this area.
We have church plate, baptismal spoons, the chalice used in the Eucharist, being buried in some of these silver hoards. People are decommissioning these items.
Whoever buried this collection of precious silver must have felt anger and resentment, because their property, their beliefs, their very identity were under attack. By the time this treasure was buried, Rome had lost the hearts and minds of the native Britons. Having invited the Romans in, absorbed and digested the rich and various influences of a classical world, Britain turned its back on Rome and looked to an independent future. The end of Roman administration was a new beginning for the people of Britain. 3.5 centuries after the Romans destroyed it, the magnificent hill fort of South Cadbury was reoccupied. It has long been imagined that the figure who led this resurgence was King Arthur.
Arthur is a kind of product of different generations and how they see themselves. Arthur was created largely by medieval romantic historians who wanted to create a kind of pseudo-chronology of events after the Roman invasion. And the trouble is it's loosely threaded together with pieces of genuine evidence. And it depends on how literally you choose to take bits of that. I rather suspect that Arthur is a kind of metaphor, a symbol for the sort of petty tribal chieftain who will have taken over power in a region after the Roman power collapsed in Britain. A man who could hold his people together.
This valiant king embodies a brave new world in which the descendants of Roman Britain began to build an independent future. And yet for centuries, we have shrouded this exciting time under a veil of mystery and labelled it the Dark Ages. Next week, we will discover that Arthur's Britain was in fact a time of creativity and progress, in which nothing less than the future identity of this country was forged. In the Oxford History of England, the great historian Sir Frank Stenton wrote, "Between the end of Roman government in Britain and the emergence of the earlier English kingdoms, there stretches a long period of which the history cannot be written." With the departure of the Roman troops, historians imagined the end of history. And from their empty pages, we have conjured up a desolate wasteland of abandoned cities, overgrown fields, and marauding barbarians, and we called this the Dark Ages. In actual fact, sophisticated societies developed in Britain in the Dark Ages. Released from its associations with Rome, Britain began to forge an independent identity. Ancient trade routes were resurrected, languages evolved, and the foundations of modern European thought were laid down. These were not the Dark Ages. The fall of Rome led to a period of political instability throughout Europe. Tribes of barbarian invaders swept across the provinces of Rome, looting and pillaging the land. St. Jerome laments this terrible time.
Savage tribes in countless numbers have overrun all parts, and those which the sword spares, famine ravages. I cannot speak without tears.
But what became of Britain on the outskirts of his crumbling empire? The trouble is, there is a gap in the historical record. At one end, we have 410, a date as indelible and emotive as 1066. 410 was the year that Rome told Britain, "Look to your own defences." At the other end, we have 597, the year in which Pope Gregory I of Rome converted the Anglo-Saxons to Christianity. In between, there are only fragments and stories, a murky historical no-man's land. The perfect breeding ground for myths and legends. Emerging from the shadows of his period is the figure of King Arthur who, if he existed at all, rose to prominence in these troubled years. But here lies a crucial paradox. How can a period of Dark Age barbarism also have produced the greatest folk hero Britain has ever had? Was Arthur invented to make up for a lack of real history, or is there some foundation to these peculiar myths? As a prehistorian, I'm used to dealing with long periods without any written records, but that doesn't mean that nothing happened. I'm going to find out what really did happen in this mysterious time. And I'm going to start in the place where the collapse of the Roman government must have been most keenly felt, the cities. The Romans built a network of civic centres across Britain. I went to York, one of the largest of these, to find out what happened after the legions left. Underneath the medieval city walls, it's possible to see the earliest layers of a city's rich history. Whilst the Roman and later Viking layers provide plenty of archaeological evidence, the elusive Dark Age layers contain few recognisable artefacts. It's almost as if the period is invisible to archaeologists. However, by the side of the Roman bridgehead in York, archaeologist Mark Wyman has made a breakthrough. By re-examining thousands of pieces of pottery thought to be part of a city's Roman history, he has begun to shed some light on the city's Dark Age past.
Okay, Francis, well, this is where we do the pottery. One thing that definitely does happen at the end of the 4th century in Britain is that coins disappeared. Coins are crucial to establish a chronology.
But with no coins available, Mark had to find a new way of interpreting the evidence.
We were looking for a type of pottery that might have continued in production beyond the end of Roman Britain.
The pottery Mark was looking at could not be matched to any traditional Roman products.
Mark, why do you believe this rather strange-looking stuff is 5th century?
Well, this is what's known as calcite gritted ware.
Yeah.
It's a late Roman coarse pottery type, manufactured in huge quantities in East Yorkshire. The material we're looking at here is actually from a site excavated by the site of the Roman bridgehead at York.
The layers that produced Mark's pottery had to be dated later than the Roman period. This suggests that pottery was being manufactured in York after the Romans left. This business of making pottery in the 5th century has put the cat among the pigeons. Why is that?
The received view of Roman Britain, one that's still quite widely held, I think, has been that Roman Britain's end is exceedingly sudden, and the archaeological material that we require to understand activity, to understand the past, just isn't being made. The reason I set out to do this research was to identify a type of artefact which we could say is manufactured in the 5th century, to argue against the idea of everything suddenly coming to a juddering halt.
Life in York did not come to a standstill in 410. Mark had found evidence for some kind of activity in the city after the Romans left. And he is not alone with these discoveries. All over the country, archaeologists are starting to piece together a picture of Dark Age Britain very different from the conventional story of collapse. It's time to start rewriting the history books. Archaeology, like all humanities, is a product of its time. And Victorian archaeologists were part of a British Empire which compared itself to Rome. So they had every reason to suggest that when great empires collapse, disaster and chaos follow. Amid the gentle hills of the Shropshire countryside lie the remains of the Roman town of Wroxeter. The romantic ruins fascinated early antiquarians, who saw it as an evocative reminder of a great civilization which had fallen into ruin. Wroxeter was first excavated in the 19th century. These Victorian archaeologists were so excited by the Roman remains here that they did not spot something that would completely rewrite the history of the town. It wasn't until the 1980s that archaeologists discovered the real story of Wroxeter.
As they wandered over the rubble, he found these two large round stones. The inspector said, well, perhaps these are the same. They noticed lines of packed rubble and plaster. And they suddenly realised they had this massive, great building. It was so big that it's a bit like trying to see an elephant standing a foot away. And the north wall was taken down, dismantled, and the rubble was used to create a huge building platform. What they were doing was making a solid foundation onto which they could then build a timber frame structure. The dating was the major problem. The big building and all the other buildings around it had to fit in between about 520 and about 590, 600.
So, I mean, we're long, long after the official end of Roman Britain in 410, aren't we? And they're building huge buildings which are laying out in Roman measurements. I mean, they're thinking like Romans, aren't they?
They are Romans. This is our perception that we think of Romans as being foreigners who come over, occupy the country and then go away again. They weren't. The people in the country Romanised. They became Roman.
I mean, central control, central administration had sort of broken down. So, I mean, who was organising, and was it an Arthur-like character?
It's a very difficult question to answer because we had no evidence.
No.
But if you think about it, this is like trying to answer the question of who lives in Buckingham Palace purely from the foundations. What we can say, however, is that this person had power. So they are someone who's able to command authority. There is a structure to the society.
The discoveries at Wroxeter were a great advance in archaeology. They opened the way for archaeologists to re-examine other Roman sites in Britain to discover what happened during the so-called Dark Ages. Hadrian's Wall was one of the most important military sites in Roman Britain. Stretching from coast to coast, the wall includes a series of garrison forts. In its heyday, this was a bustling community of soldiers and their families defending the northern fringes of the empire. What happened after the Roman army pulled out has long been a mystery. It used to be believed that King Arthur fought his final battle of Camlan near this remote, windy spot on Hadrian's Wall. But recent work has shown that within the fort of Birdoswald, there was an altogether more extraordinary archaeological story to tell. Birdoswald is the most westerly of the series of forts which line the wall. Miriam Lincoln showed me round the remains of this military headquarters.
It's the main road through the fort, buildings either side, huge drill hall, the granaries to the south here.
It was the granaries that archaeologist Tony Wilmot decided to examine when he began excavation here.
I just had a feeling from looking around the site that late Roman would survive quite well. And chap in one corner said, Tony, I think we've got a bit of a straight line here. And a chap in another corner said, it's a bit of a right angle. And I basically went to the top of the tower of the farmhouse, looked down, and there was just this great rectangle sitting there.
Above the stone foundations of the Roman granaries, Tony discovered the remains of a huge structure which was built long after the Roman troops withdrew. It was a unique archaeological discovery. What was it like?
It's jaw-dropped, you know. you think, God, this is it, really. You know?
You've got this lovely, huge, open structure, thatched roof, and it would be the first thing you saw as you came through the gateway there.
I put one of my most experienced diggers just to give a very quick clean to this slight trench, and I didn't tell her what I was looking for. And I said, anything odd about this? And she said, there's these sort of hard, flat patches. Yeah. Oh, where are they? And she went, well, there's one here, and I pointed to that.
Yeah.
And there's one here, and I pointed to that. And sure enough, they paired up. It was completely objective because I hadn't told her what I was doing. That's how it became confirmed.
The strange markings that Tony found were the remains of 12 footings which formed the skeleton of an enormous wooden hall that had been built after the Roman troops departed. So what kind of a group of men built a building like that? I mean, it's a socking great big thing.
I think the key is there's no break. The commander, perhaps even a hereditary commander by this point, would have become a central authority. And you can see that kind of gradually morphing into the idea of a petty king or a petty leader.
Are we talking about a sort of protection racket?
It's not hard to see them saying, well, OK, carry on paying your Roman taxes and we'll carry on seeing you all right. And from taxation to protection racket is perhaps not such a huge jump.
The history books tell us Roman soldiers pulled out, turned out the lights and darkness descended.
That's it, yeah. It wasn't happening here. These were native Britons. They had nowhere to go. This was home, yes. And so had to find a living somehow. Certainly there was no mass withdrawal from Birdoswald.
Do you reckon there are more late forts along Hadrian's Wall?
I think there's certain to be. These communities didn't just disappear. If you're sitting pretty behind some high stone walls, you're not just going to disappear and start practicing subsistence farming. You're going to stay put. There's started to be evidence from a number of places now that this sort of thing took place. Perhaps Birdoswald is just one of a network of fortified centres that are growing up. You could go down to the southwest, you've got hill forts being reoccupied. I think that we should see Birdoswald as one of those, rather than being part of the Roman frontier system at that time. Everything's changed.
Yeah. To the east of Birdoswald is a lake called Crag Loch. From here, archaeologists have extracted soil samples to construct a picture of how the landscape changed when the Roman troops pulled out. This process, known as pollen analysis, involves examining the types of trees that once grew here. I like trees, which is why I've planted them on my farm. But to archaeologists, the presence of trees on land that had once been farmed shows that the countryside has been abandoned. And in the Dark Ages, the traditional view is that the countryside reverted to a wild wood once the Romans had withdrawn. The work at Crag Loch challenges this view. It was carried out by Petra Dark of Reading University.
Pollen analysis gives us really good evidence for what the countryside of the past was like. We can actually identify the pollen grains of different plants, like the trees, the cereals and so on. And we can count the pollen samples taken through cores of sediment and reconstruct vegetation change over long timescales.
Petra is able to build up a picture of what the landscape looked like hundreds of years ago.
If we get cereal pollen, that tells us that they're growing crops nearby. If we have tree pollen, that tells us there was woodland nearby. And this is very important for reconstructing changes in farming in the past, because we can see were they farming very intensively or had areas of land being abandoned to farming, in which case they quite rapidly revert to woodland.
By carbon dating the samples, Petra is able to tell when a landscape changed.
By the Roman period, this is quite an open landscape, a lot of the woodland's gone.
Petra's charts clearly show that at Hadrian's Wall there was not a massive increase in forest when the Romans pulled out.
By the end of the Roman period, we start to get an increase of birch pollen. But the other trees are not really changing, so there isn't massive woodland regeneration happening.
Contrary to popular belief, the landscape at Hadrian's Wall did not revert to forest when the Romans left. Petra has compared samples from a selection of sites across Britain. While some do see an increase in woodland, at many the land continued to be farmed in exactly the same way. And in certain places, land use actually intensified after the Romans departed.
We can't generalise across the whole of the landscape in the way that, in the 1950s, before we had this evidence, there was this generalisation. That's much too simple a picture.
Petra's work demolishes the vision of Britain reverting to a wild wood once the Romans departed. In forts like Birdoswald and towns like Wroxeter, the end of Roman administration did not bring about the breakdown of society. Released from the controlling hand of Rome, new leaders emerged and society regrouped. But this new independence did not mean that Britain had cut herself off from the rest of the world. A series of extraordinary contacts were about to be made with some of the most powerful players in the ancient world. At Tintagel, on the Atlantic coast of Cornwall, there is a rugged promontory. This dramatic site has long been associated with the Dark Age warrior King Arthur. I think this one of the most romantic places in Britain. And I'm not surprised that Arthur is supposed to have been conceived in a castle here. The trouble is, those dramatic ruins over there are 13th century and have nothing whatsoever to do with Arthur or with Camelot. King Arthur first became associated with Tintagel when the author Geoffrey of Monmouth wrote a version of a legend in which King Arthur is born here. The Earl of Cornwall decided to build an Arthurian-style castle on the headland. Tourists have been coming here ever since to catch a glimpse of Camelot. However, the Dark Age story of Tintagel is far more exciting. Excavations here have shed new light on Britain's ancient contacts with the rest of the world. Charles Thomas explains.
This is the classic way to see it, to approach it, because we've got the island, we've got that neck there, and you can see most of the important parts. You can see the top, the summit there. In the early 1980s, there was a fairly dramatic fire here, and the whole of the top of the plateau caught fire. The grass burnt, even the roots burnt. We then had a unique opportunity to examine 2 or 3 acres. We found that the top, far from being bare, was covered with the remains, the footings of little huts. 20 or 30 rectilinear buildings. We thought that these were all medieval. We now know they're post-Roman. We've investigated 10% of the top of the island. We found that the pottery, although burnt, was still recognizable as post-Roman imported pottery. Something had been taking place at the top, on a big scale.
At the precise location where writers imagined a Dark Age king being born, modern archaeology had found the remains of a large settlement dated to the middle of the Dark Ages. And this was not all. Trampled amongst the remains of the buildings were thousands of sherds of intriguing pottery.
The finds are extraordinary because there were large quantities of wheel-made pottery. None of this was the same as we get in Roman Britain, and none of it was anything that could conceivably have been produced here in post-Roman times.
Archaeologists thought that the pottery looked Mediterranean in origin. But to be certain, they had it analysed by David Williams at Southampton University.
What I did with colleagues is to make a thin section of part of the actual pot, stick it onto a glass slide and grind it down so it's terribly thin. When you put it under the microscope, you can actually see the minerals and the rock fragments in the clay of the vessel. Right. And they will actually reflect what type of geological area the clay came from.
So if I look through this, at that slide you've got in there, lots of white bits and, 3 sort of pinky things.
That's right. That's serpentine. Oh. That isn't a common mineral at all. Yeah. You do get examples of serpentine around the Mediterranean in western Cyprus, and they also occur just across the coast in southern Turkey. There's a whole string of kilns around there. When we compare them with the Tintagel pottery, and it's almost a dead ringer.
David discovered that the Tintagel pottery had been made in one of a series of enormous kiln sites in southern Turkey. So much pottery was produced at these sites that it still lies in huge piles by the side of the road today.
These are thick, sturdy vessels that were made for the buffeting of sea transportation. They were very heavy indeed.
These heavy-duty pots were used for transporting goods such as olive oil and wine around the Mediterranean.
The ship that visited Tintagel may well have started from Turkey, perhaps to pick up further cargoes, tableware, micaceous jars, across to the Peloponnese, pick up more amphora, and then to Carthage, where possibly it picked up North African olive oil amphora, plus the African tablewares, and from there, possibly through the Straits of Gibraltar to Tintagel.
The big containers, they're really the Coca-Cola tins of their period. If that's turning up in Tintagel, these things don't last forever. The first time some idiot drops it, it's shattered. You can say this is a group of pottery from the Mediterranean which got here in some such period as 530 to 560.
Britain was at the edge of a vast trade network driven by Constantinople, the new powerhouse of the ancient world. Power shifted to Constantinople, modern-day Istanbul, after Rome was sacked by the barbarians in 410. The Eastern Empire continued to be run here for a further 1,000 years. But what brought these Mediterranean traders to Britain? What did we have to offer them? A discovery in Devon in 1995 provided a clue. Divers looking for the remains of a galleon came across a most unusual find.
This estuary was mistaken as the entrance to Plymouth Sound. And then they'd see this great big expanse of water, and of course you've got this hidden reef of rocks.
Well, you hit that lot. I mean, you've had it, haven't you?
The first two divers came up to the surface, big smiles from ear to ear, with these tin ingots.
Oh, look at that. God, it's heavy, isn't it?
Yes, it's pure tin. When we had them analysed, they analysed them at 99.9% pure tin. And this is a clue that they're very old. One theory is there was a boat anchored out there, they were ferrying them out and they turned over on the reef.
Tin had been a British export since prehistoric times. It was known to the Romans as the British metal. Is this what Byzantine traders were coming to collect from Tintagel?
If you control a large area, you let it be known that by midsummer the tribute you're going to enforce is X blocks of tin, and you collect a lot of this. And this is something which would be extremely exchangeable in terms of Mediterranean goodies.
The tin that the divers found lay a few metres away from a beach, which has yielded some intriguing remains. Coastal erosion has revealed hearths where meat had been cooked. Could these be connected to the tin trade? Sam Turner is about to start excavating here.
Well, there's several hearths eroding from the cliff. The site's been known about since the 1960s and it's been monitored since, and the erosion's got really quite bad recently. In fact, you can see some of the charcoaly deposits here in the face of the sand cliff, blackened material.
Got the charcoal tail.
Yeah, big lumps of charcoal. And that's part of a hearth which extends sort of 5 or 6 feet across this area.
But I mean, there's more than just charcoal there. I mean, just looking down here, look there, what's that? It looks like a bit of bone.
There's bone from various species here. Some of the bone has clearly been butchered on the site.
Yeah. I mean, what's going on? They're right on the seashore. It must have something to do with it.
This is probably some kind of seasonal settlement associated with activity that was going on here, probably trading activity. And we know that imported pottery from the Mediterranean has been found at this site with these kind of features. This is the kind of trading activity we know was going on all around the Southwest Peninsula at this time.
This Mediterranean pottery. Why is it being used on the port? I mean, you don't get champagne bottles being opened in the port of London, do you? I mean, that happens somewhere else.
Certainly, I think that this activity must be associated with the social elite. These presumably would be the people who are here undertaking trade, using it as a meeting place to meet and exchange news and ideas.
Sam's discoveries were not unique. All along the coast, archaeologists are beginning to find evidence for more of this elaborate activity. On this shoreline alone, 500 sherds of pottery and 10 feasting sites have been found. These hearths were the remains of what can only be described as beach parties held on the occasion of visits from Mediterranean traders. Such festivities indicate there was more to this Mediterranean contact than the straightforward exchange of tin for wine. Today we place different aspects of our lives into clearly labelled boxes: work, trade, religion, politics. But in the past, these partitions didn't exist. So I don't suppose that the Mediterranean and British traders were there just to exchange goods. These beach markets were to do with something altogether more profound: the ceremonial exchange of beliefs and ideas. And some archaeologists even believe that these ceremonies were politically driven.
In the 6th century, the Byzantine Emperor Justinian I organised an attempt to reconquer the Western Roman Empire. This programme of reconquest was accompanied by a diplomatic initiative, a charm offensive to try to get local elites across Western Europe on board. One area where such elites existed was in Western Britain. And it's possible that what we see as trade between the Byzantine world and the British West was in fact diplomacy between Constantinople and the British kings who ruled that area.
Whether or not these traders are on a political mission, I am certain that this contact was never purely commercial. The trade networks established between Britain and Byzantium provided a basis for the transmission of spiritual and intellectual ideas.
They're bringing with them a whole range of new ideas. Archaeology can't show us that. Archaeology and history and language between them can infer its existence. And the pure archaeology, the dirt archaeology of pots, shows us one method by which it could have come. So, yes, there is a trade in ideas.
The Byzantine merchants did not sail halfway across the known world to visit a deteriorating island. They came to an economically independent country whose people had goods and ideas to share with the rest of the world. But what were these ideas? There was one more step in the pottery story that would reveal the words of a Dark Age civilization hidden for centuries. Very little written material survives from the 5th and 6th centuries in Britain. For a long time, this was taken as proof that these were illiterate, uneducated times. In actual fact, nothing could be further from the truth. Dark Age Britain was a time of intellectual as well as economic advance. A single sherd of Mediterranean pottery, identical to the tintagel material, was recently found on the remote island of Caldy off the south coast of Wales. Caldy has been a holy island for hundreds of years. It still houses a monastery today. Jonathan Wooding showed me around.
It's the only piece we've found here, but where you find one, there's doubtless got to be more. Eastern ceramics, where they're turning up here, represent a period when the East is interested in the West. It's sending trade missions, diplomatic missions, whatever it may be, but Eastern people are turning up in Celtic Britain and they're expecting to find people who are essentially like them, descendants of Romans, who know the same languages, the same rituals, the same basic cultural ideas.
Caldy was part of the early monastic movement, which arrived in Britain with the pottery on boats from the Mediterranean.
Well, the monastic movement arrives at the same time as the departure of Roman rule. In the East, it was already playing a part in providing a new leadership almost, a new focus of leadership in a changing society, and I'm sure it was much the same here. People took it up with great enthusiasm as an alternative to the more settled or urban Christianity of the Roman world.
Dozens of monasteries sprung up in Britain in the Dark Age period, and they produced a new class of learned monk.
There is one historical source for Dark Age Britain, written by a monk named Gildas in the 6th century, about 100 years after the departure of the Romans. It's an extraordinary, arousing account of this country's history. It was written in high-grade and rather flowery Latin. It was clearly intended for a sophisticated and literate audience, because it's peppered with classical references.
Gildas was the preeminent theologian of monasticism in his era. The great founder of Irish monasteries on the continent actually cites him as someone that the Pope ought to have read in writing to the Pope, not just any old Pope, but Gregory the Great, the most monastic Pope really of the first millennium. He is very much a figure who is known all over Western Europe. A world that can produce a Gildas is the learned world in close connection with a wider intellectual, a wider religious community. He certainly isn't just a unique figure. He's unique in perhaps our records, but that's tells you more about our records than it does about the time.
Gildas and men like him were not isolated monks hidden away from reality, but scholars in touch with the intellectual and religious ideas of their time.
We see a Britain that is in contact with the rest of the world. It's a normal process of contact. It's not just an Eastern missionary turning up in an odd place. I think we have to start thinking about it now as a sort of much more global thing. I think finds in places like Tintagel and Bantham are on a scale now that make it unlikely that there's just one or two ships. But more finds are turning up every year, and I think in time we will have a much clearer picture of the scale and the importance of these contacts. They're more or less contacts that escaped history. So that's an example of where archaeology has really told you something that you just simply didn't know before.
Literacy was not confined to the monastic elite in Dark Age Britain. Caldy Island had one more secret to give up in the form of an ancient stone inscribed in Latin.
With the sign of the cross, I ask from all those walking there that they pray for the soul from within of Cadogan.
This is rhythmic, syllabic, Adonic verse, and it is by centuries the oldest. These people are using the meters that become the standard fare of every subsequent European literature. It's not Dark Age, it is not illiterate.
Stones like the one in Caldy have been found scattered across Western Britain. These inscribed stones provide clear evidence for a highly literate society in Dark Age Britain. They are memorials, written not by kings or priests, but by ordinary people committing their thoughts to stone. For centuries, these inscriptions have been dismissed as the clumsy scrawling of a semi-literate society. In actual fact, they give us unique insight into the ideas that were structuring early British thought. The job of deciphering these ancient messages has been the work of David Howlett, editor of the Latin Medieval Dictionary in Oxford.
We're coming into the oldest part of the Bodleian Library, and what we see here is an embodiment in stone of the view of the universe that our ancestors had adopted from antiquity. 7 liberal arts, the human constructs of language, grammar, rhetoric, and logic, and the divine hard science, all of them mathematical. Arithmetic is static number, music is moving number, astronomy, geometry.
David believes that the structures which still shape learning today were first formulated in the Dark Ages.
Was it some form of intellectual opposition that structured the way they thought?
It was a cooperation, a combination. You have the school of languages at the same door as the School of Geometry and Arithmetic. And over there, the School of Astronomy in the same door as the School of Rhetoric. It was a cooperation, a combination, the human arts with divine mathematical art. You need both. You cannot have one without the other. During the 6th century, modern Europe is invented, and it's invented here. Inside Britain, what we have is both this highly polished rhetorical latinity from Gildas 130 years after the departure of the legions, and these stone inscriptions. Now, the inscriptions have looked like ropey, odd Latin prose because they are, in fact, verse. Nobody read them aloud to see that they go tumpty, tumpty, tumpty. It's just there, you see it. And once you see it, it transforms your view of what you're reading, and it even more seriously transforms your view of the society from which this emerged.
Some of these stone inscriptions contain hidden layers of meaning.
And the inscription reads, Carausius hic jacet in hoc, congeries lapidum. Carausius here lies in this, a heap of stones. Straightforward. But if you read it backwards, it reads, lapides gericon hoc in jacet hic ius auscar, which is a faultless dactylic hexameter.
That's classical Latin.
This is classical Latin, poetry, but read backwards. And if we return to the straightforward Carausius inscription and count at intervals of 7 letters, we find the name of the woman who designed this, which is Viola. Jorvert and Roalaun in sepulchres look in peace for the awesome advent of the judgment. Sanctissima mulier hic jacet, quae fuit amatissima conjux bivatisi. Audiva, a most holy woman, here lies, who was the most beloved wife of Bivatisus. In morals, discipline, and for wisdom than gold and precious stones, this woman was better. Now, she is the most holy, most beloved wife of a bishop.
You've said that there are thousands of these Dark Age inscriptions. That does rather imply that there were an awful lot of readers.
Some of these inscriptions are on hillsides in deepest Brycheiniog. They imply that there is a large class, large enough numbers to make this worthwhile. These islands are the focus for the real survival of Latin. If you imagine that at the time of the departure of the legions, the Brits are the only people in Europe who carry on writing very high-level literary Latin. And the reason this remained pure was that these were the only people in Europe who did not speak a Romance mother tongue. There was less linguistic interference from one to the other, so they learned Latin by the book. Rather like Salman Rushdie learning English by the book and then writing very high-level literary language. And the Brits are the only people in Europe who do this.
Are we looking at a Renaissance here?
For a Renaissance to occur, you have to have a Dark Age. And I don't think the Dark Age ever existed. What I see is continuity in the intellectual life. The fall of Rome in 410, what caused the withdrawal of the legions from Britain, is a finite historical moment with great ramifications, and they're serious and catastrophic. And people have just supposed that that was what happened in Roman Britain, but it didn't. This is the only place that did not happen.
So, in other words, instead of turning the lights out, do you actually think that the lights were turned up brighter?
This is the only place in which the lights were turned up brighter.
Not only had Britain survived the Roman withdrawal, refashioning towns and resurrecting trade links, she had started to lay the foundation for an intellectually exciting future. I started this journey with the mythical figure of Arthur looming in the background, a reminder of the lack of real evidence we have for the Dark Ages. I ended it believing that I had really found my Camelot. This period had given birth to myths and legends as magical as that of Arthur, because this really was an extraordinarily creative time.
Arthur may be historical fiction, but he is put in a real historical situation. In order to crystallize it, there becomes a person round whom these myths gather. And I don't mean myths as lies. This imagined golden age did have a real solid foundation. And that's Camelot.
My own belief, for what it's worth, is that there was an Arthur, that he was a local war leader, and all took place in the north of Britain.
Arthur could have been one of many strong leaders in this turbulent society. Perhaps he was one of the tough soldiers on Hadrian's Wall who took advantage of a crumbling government. Maybe he was a Romanized sophisticate who helped restructure towns like Wroxeter in order to carry on living a civilized life. He could have been a merchant made good, one of a southwestern elite with a bountiful Mediterranean links, or part of the monastic elite of the West, well versed in Latin and the holy life. In looking for Arthur, I have found a world far more exciting and far more real than any romantic tale of knights in shining armour. These were the real men and women of Arthur's Britain. But this world could not last forever. The Roman town of Wroxeter, where archaeologists had found such remarkable evidence for Dark Age survival and rebuilding, did eventually collapse. By the 7th century, a pagan ruler known as Penda overwhelmed the town and its inhabitants.
This town's fate was sealed.
So if ever an Arthur was required, it was then.
It was, but he wasn't there. These fantastic early Welsh poems talk about Arthur-like figures. They talk about this period, but they're actually being written in the 8th and 9th century, and one can imagine this sort of sense that if only there was someone who could come and help us, if only there was someone who could fight off these oppressors. Yeah. And I think that that's what this Arthur is all about. Yeah. Arthur is all about this wish, this nostalgia for a past that never actually happened, but only if it had, they would have turned it all back and they would have kept their kingdom.
Whether or not they had an Arthur to protect them, the inhabitants of Wroxeter abandoned their town in the 7th century. Changes which had been happening elsewhere in Britain had finally overtaken them. It was a revolutionary tide which came not from the hills and mountains of Wales and the West, but from the flat, fertile plains of eastern England. The end of Wroxeter was the beginning of a new chapter in Britain's history, the Anglo-Saxon invasions. In the next programme, I'm going to show how archaeologists are beginning to question whether even this celebrated event really did happen after all. The conventional story about the making of England describes how the Britons sunk into a state of lethargy after the departure of the Roman troops. They were only revived by a massive infusion of Anglo-Saxon blood from the other side of the North Sea. These robust tribesmen arrived in boats along the eastern shores of Britain. It was a brave new world in which dark forests are felled and England is born. The trouble is, there is no archaeological evidence for the Anglo-Saxon invasion. The traditional story of the making of England is completely wrong. The real story will reshape our future and rewrite our past.
As an island people, we Brits have been obsessed with the idea of invasion. And the story of the arrival of the Anglo-Saxons has long been accepted as a part of our history. I'm going to show that the myth of the Anglo-Saxon invasion is just a tale. Leading-edge archaeology is beginning to re-examine the dramatic changes that took place in this country in the centuries after the Roman troops departed. And a very different story to the one which we have become accustomed is emerging. Just before World War II, archaeologists in Suffolk uncovered one of the greatest discoveries of our time: the Anglo-Saxon burial mounds at Sutton Hoo. Helen Geek explains.
Mrs. Pretty decided to investigate the burial mounds that were on her property. She rang up Ipswich Museum and asked for advice on a freelance archaeologist. It seems like another world where a landowner can simply employ an archaeologist to open their burial mounds, but that's what happened. In Mound 1 over there, he discovered an intact ship and a burial chamber. When news of this got out, archaeologists from Cambridge University and the British Museum came in to help, and the most fabulous, extraordinary archaeological treasure was discovered there.
Excavations revealed the burial chamber of a person in a wooden ship. He was accompanied by a wealth of fabulous objects. This was the grave of a very rich man.
Helmets are incredibly rare. Special headgear seems to be appropriate for a king, as it still is today. He's got other things like the strange whetstone that's made into a sceptre. It's got polish in the middle where your hand could have held it, and a little cup which could sit on your knee, so you can hold your sceptre like a modern king. Some people see a very strong Swedish influence. Some people see a very strong classical Byzantine influence. And other people say that he's got a bit of everything. He's trying out a lot of different methods of making us see that he's an important ruler of the East Angles.
By the 7th century, parts of Britain had become a series of politically powerful kingdoms, later to be known as England. Do you suppose a boatload of Anglo-Saxon royal family came sailing up the Deben and thought, whoopee, this is the place for me, got off the boat and set up their kingdom here?
The origin myths that we have recorded by people like Bede do seem to indicate that in the 5th century boatloads of royalty did row up and think, well, I will create my kingdom here. But we just don't have any archaeological evidence to back that up at all. What seems much more likely is that by some process of internal social development, kings arose at some point in the late 6th century and then decided to kind of create this origin myth to explain where they'd come from. Probably they just murdered and fought their way to the top, but they wanted to say that they'd always been royal. In fact, they're descended from the gods, you know.
Sutton Hoo is the most elaborate of a number of rich Anglo-Saxon burials over the south and east of Britain. Archaeologists are divided about where these powerful new leaders came from. Heinrich Harker favours the idea they were invaders.
Until Sutton Hoo was found, Taplow was the richest Anglo-Saxon grave in England. These big Anglo-Saxon burials of the 7th century were very often located on the tops of ridges. Taking up a dominant position in the landscape demonstrates who you are, who your family was.
Heinrich Harker believes an invasion is the best way of explaining the changes in culture that took place after the Romans left. Why do we have to have migrations? It's very difficult to prove that people came here in large numbers from abroad.
Francis, I believe you can demonstrate that this is still, given the evidence, the best possible explanation. Your argument is we do not need migrations to explain culture change. This is essentially the underlying argument.
Yes.
I agree with that. And actually, if at the moment you look to Russia, post-Soviet Russia, you see a huge culture change, but it is not brought in by immigrant Westerners.
Exactly.
It is marketed there. Of course, you can say there is no proof that they came here, and I accept that. We cannot trace them across the North Sea, but it is still the best explanation.
Heinrich, I'd love to agree with you, only I can't see any outsiders would have come here without there being one hell of a fight. And there is no evidence for a struggle. If people move on to my land, I'm not happy about that.
If you're there, you are not.
Right, so you think that people would actually have moved out? Because there isn't much evidence for that.
After the collapse of a civilization, you do have population decline. If there is population decline, there was also space, more space in the landscape than there was in the Roman system.
I don't believe that there was a hole in British society. If anything, you know, the taxes were removed, I would have thought people said, whoopee, it's Christmas, I don't have to pay taxes, I'm much better off. And so when the Romans left, people actually probably got more prosperous.
Very much a farmer's view, I would have thought. I like that.
Farmer's view or not, the invasion explanation just isn't enough. Whenever archaeologists can't explain a period of social change or innovation, they reach for the catch-all explanation: new people, invasion. But there isn't actually any evidence to support this story. We just can't prove it. Science, however, is trying to. At University College London, Professor of Genetics Mark Thomas and his team have conducted a survey of the DNA in the British Isles. The male genetic marker is known as a Y chromosome. A father passes a largely unchanged copy of his own Y chromosome to his son. It is a very good way of tracing ancestry through history. By comparing Y chromosome information from different populations, Mark has tried to establish how closely the populations are related. He discovered that there was an unusually high similarity between DNA from Britain and parts of Holland.
Within England, all the towns look very similar, but different to the Welsh towns. And the more remarkable feature was the incredible similarity between the English towns, genetically, and the Frisians. In fact, we couldn't statistically tell any difference between them.
This suggests the native British Y chromosome has, at some point in history, been mixed with that of people from Northern Europe. Complex statistics were used to work out when this genetic mix might have happened.
We conclude we would need the mass migration in the last 2,500 years that was 100% replacement, or if it was less, it would have to have been more recently. And if we assume that that mass migration was the Anglo-Saxon mass migration, then we estimate that that replacement must have been between 50 and 100%.
The sheer completeness of this population change really does conflict with the archaeological evidence. 3 million people shoved out.
Well, they don't show that. Now, we can't say anything about what the process was. As I said, that could be pushing, or it could be slaughtering, or it could be something much more benign, like just economic differences between the different populations, and over time a gradual replacement. We can't really say how it happened.
But another team of geneticists in the same department as Mark have conducted a similar survey and come up with very different results. They conclude that the native British Y chromosome has not been largely replaced in southern and eastern England. Furthermore, they stated that it's not possible to distinguish between the genetic influence of the Anglo-Saxons and that of the Vikings, who definitely did invade Britain in the 8th and 9th centuries. I just don't think that we should rely on these genetic versions of history on their own, especially when two similar studies produce such different results. I'm also pretty suspicious of simple explanations in complex times. The dramatic changes that took place in the 5th and 6th centuries laid the foundations for the modern identity of this country. I'm going to show these changes were not the result of mass invasions. And in revising this powerful origin myth, I will discover who we, the English, really are. On the south coast of Hampshire, at the entrance to a natural harbour, is one of the best preserved Roman buildings in Britain. This is Porchester Castle. It's one of a series of coastal forts built by the Romans in the 3rd and 4th centuries. They're known as Saxon shore forts because it's still widely accepted that they were constructed to keep out marauding Anglo-Saxon bands from the other side of the channel. But in actual fact, they may have been used for a very different purpose. In total, 11 shore forts skirt the southern and eastern coast. From Porchester in the south, around the coast, these shore forts have been taken as an imposing reminder of the Anglo-Saxon threat, all the way up to Brancaster in Norfolk. One of the most easterly of these forts, Birr Castle, still commands the landscape. All of this, all of the green fields over there,
would have been what was termed the Great Estuary. Combination of open water and marsh and intertidal creeks, that kind of thing. Probably until 10th, 12th century.
Andrew Pearson has been re-examining the forts and has come to the surprising conclusion that they may have nothing to do with Anglo-Saxons.
I think that the traditional view of these sites is that they are a defence against pirate raiders from across the Channel. From Saxony, from Frisia, from Jutland, basically from the peoples who are, in later periods, going to colonise Britain.
The name Saxon Shore Fort actually comes from a Roman military list, which was translated in the 16th century by the famous antiquarian William Camden. What the term Saxon refers to is unclear.
What Camden said it pretty much went as archaeological fact for many sort of centuries to come, really. I think also what he hit on was a very evocative idea. It's very dramatic. It's also very simple. That these forts are put up as a defence against the Saxons. The count is called the Count of the Saxon Shore. Now, whether that means it is the shore being attacked by the Saxons or settled by the Saxons, really we just don't know.
Andrew has found that the huge walls are actually better suited to protecting goods kept inside the forts, rather than attacking enemies from outside.
Well, I think these sites are doing much more than defending the coastline. If the Saxons came raiding, it wouldn't have been monthly, it may not have even been every year or every 10 years. So in terms of what these forts do, I think it's much more likely that they have a major economic role, or perhaps a supply role, rather than this kind of defensive function that's ascribed to them normally.
So what you seem to be suggesting then is that these forts could have been used actually to help trade from out of Britain rather than stop people coming in.
Yes, I think rather than trying to block access to the interior, as is perhaps traditionally thought, in fact these are quite the opposite insofar as materials and goods are coming here and then being shipped outwards and beyond into the empire as a whole.
Andrew has found no archaeological evidence that these forts were built to defend against an Anglo-Saxon invasion. So what is the evidence for invasion? The Yorkshire Wolds are the last of a series of chalk downlands which spread east across Britain. And it's here that Anglo-Saxon invaders are supposed to have settled 1,500 years ago. In these fields, one of the most extraordinary archaeological investigations is being carried out. 30 years ago, archaeologist Dominic Powsland was asked to excavate some 5th century burials that had turned up in a quarry site near the village of West Heslerton. Dominic has conducted one of the largest archaeological surveys in the world here, scrutinising every inch of the landscape for traces of its ancient past. Such a comprehensive survey should confirm the conventional view of the 5th and 6th centuries as a time when invaders took over. Except it didn't.
This is a tremendous settlement that may be as early as the Bronze Age.
Dominic discovered the remains of miles of farms and villages. The settlement began life 4,000 years ago and continued through to the 8th century, spanning the crucial Anglo-Saxon invasion period. Dominic calls this discovery the ladder settlement.
We've got the ladder running straight through, following the edge of the field where we've been digging. Yeah. It runs straight through here.
So those crop marks there?
That's the trackway down the spine of the settlement. Basically comprised a series of farmsteads or even small villages following the trackway, hugging the very edge of the wetlands. We've traced the settlement for 15 kilometres. We've surveyed in detail about 7.5 to 8 kilometres. I'm sure it goes all the way to the coast.
This is a new kind of archaeology, dedicated to understanding the long-term life and meaning of an entire landscape.
I've had a team out there walking from dawn till dusk for 3 years, and the results are absolutely staggering.
It's a long walk. I have walked personally further than from Land's End to John O'Groats. I mean, and that's just in these little fields up and down here. This is a fluxgate gradiometer, which measures minute variations in magnetic signal under the soil. Imagine this field was untouched by human hand, and someone comes along and digs a ditch across it. And then that ditch fills in with various forms of material. Stubble getting into the ditch. Then it all gets filled in again and it looks like this, you can't see the ditch. When we come along, we walk over it and we read the signal. So we'll get 0 all around it. Then suddenly it'll go up 1, 2, 3, 4, 2, 3, 1, 0, 0, 0. And we just walk backwards and forwards across that and build up this picture as we go.
The gradiometer picks up soil disturbances, which were made hundreds, even thousands of years ago. How much more have you got to do you reckon?
Too much. We're over halfway there. Having said that, where's the end?
Printed out, this is what the geophysics looks like.
That must be the biggest geophysical survey in the country, isn't it?
I believe it's now the biggest in the world.
Good grief. This massive evidence, Dominic, surely tells us a different story about population in the area, doesn't it?
Yeah, it must mean we've got a high population. The idea that there's hardly anybody living here is completely unsustainable. We end up with the same sort of density of settlement as we would have had 100 years ago.
Once the surveys are done, Dominic and his team go to work. "4,000 years of history lie beneath the soil, just waiting to be uncovered.
We're just coming out from the foot of the wold. Runs, in fact, quite steeply down to the wetland and the main area of occupation throughout later prehistory.
The geology of this part of the country is unique. A thick layer of wind-blown sand protects ancient remains, which in other areas of Britain the modern plough has destroyed. Dominic and his team were about to start digging an archaeological gold mine.
Now, the first time we looked at the ladder settlement, we opened a 15-metre area, and there were 35,000 finds. This is a bit sort of like a archaeological gold dust, because we have archaeology we can't see, but we know it's well preserved. Yeah. And that is very rare. In Britain, there are probably a few square kilometres of archaeology that's that well preserved in the countryside.
Dominic's excavations uncovered what the ghostly patterns of a geophysics survey had hinted at.
the actual remains of houses, trackways and settlements which spanned 3,000 years of ancient history.
This is the field we're working in at the moment, and the ladder settlement comes through here. We can magically put layers and layers of the past on the top of this air photography. There is the line of the ladder settlement going right the way through the field there.
So what can the ladder settlement tell us about the arrival of the Anglo-Saxons? The archaeological remains of invasion are usually clear enough to spot. The Roman army in the 1st century and the Viking invaders of the 8th century both left their archaeological mark in the shape of war cemeteries and deliberately destroyed houses and religious sites. But Dominic could find no such evidence. What he did find was a village and a cemetery full of people who looked like Anglo-Saxons.
The Anglo-Saxon cemetery is located here underneath the main road. We've got the cemetery. So we set off in search of the settlement, and we found the whole of the Anglo-Saxon village, 49 acres. The shadow of the balloon is now entering the site of the early Anglo-Saxon village, which extended right up into the foot of the hills. Absolutely huge, much bigger than the present village. So if we zoom in on
Dominic's meticulous surveys would have been able to pick up the massive disruption that an invasion causes on a landscape. But all he could find was evidence of peaceful and continuous settlement.
Anglo-Saxon people there, Roman people there, Iron Age people, Bronze Age people, and of course move into the field next door and things go absolutely crazy. And we can't argue that this is a farm. This has got to be sort of small village.
Oh, yeah.
And of course, just to the south of it, all these little blimps here, this is another cemetery.
Well, it's sort of at a loss for words. I mean, you have got a long-term settlement, you've got the cemetery here, you've got a complete way of life, and it's vanished.
It's flat, dusty, sandy, and it looks like there's nothing here.
And it goes on for kilometre after kilometre. That's fantastic. Dominic discovered that the site had been occupied from prehistory until the middle of the 8th century. Neolithic cemeteries, Bronze Age barrows, Roman settlements, Anglo-Saxon villages were all part of this continuously occupied landscape. There were no gaps of occupation, no war cemeteries. There were no dramatic changes in the layout of the villages. In short, there was no invasion. What there was, however, was a change in fashion. Clothes, pottery, weapons and burial practices underwent a dramatic change in the centuries after the Roman government collapsed. These new fashions are very similar to styles found on the continent. And this change in fashion did not just happen at West Heslerton. For decades, these burials have been taken as the key piece of evidence that a new set of people had taken over. But what were invading Anglo-Saxons doing in Dominic's peaceful landscape? Could it be that they weren't actually invaders?
There'll be one here in this field somewhere.
Dominic gave some of the skeletons from his Anglo-Saxon cemetery to Paul Budd at Durham University. Paul has pioneered a new form of biological research called stable isotope analysis.
What we're really interested in actually is the teeth, and particularly the tooth enamel, because tooth enamel is formed in childhood, and unlike any other tissue in the body, it's not remodeled during life. It's giving you a little window, a little microcosm of what was happening in your diet, what you were eating at the time of your childhood when the tooth was formed.
Paul has discovered that tooth enamel has within it materials specific to the person's location of birth. One of these materials contains oxygen isotopes.
Your main source of oxygen is the oxygen that you consume as water. Because you're eating local foods, this signal will find its way into your bones and into your teeth.
By measuring the oxygen isotopes in a person's tooth enamel, Paul is able to tell what climate and in what part of the world they were born.
This is a technique which offers the opportunity of identifying first-generation immigrants specifically, because you can look at people who you are going to see, people who grew up somewhere different.
Paul successfully analysed 24 of the bodies from Dominic's cemetery, and a few of these were indeed foreigners, but the other results were surprising.
The things that we expected that we might see would be some continental immigrants at West Heslerton. And in fact, we did see 4 individuals from the site who have drinking water which you can't really find in the UK.
So were these rich, swaggering, warrior-type people?
No, the interesting thing about those 4 is that they're all females. They're very poorly furnished graves. And in fact, they're the only 4 females that essentially don't have any dress fittings at all.
Household servants or something like that.
Well, it certainly seems to be the lower status people, yeah. The most likely candidate is going to be sort of Scandinavia, Norwegian sort of coast up here, or possibly Sweden over here.
Right. What about the remainder of the population? Presumably they were all Yorkshiremen, were they?
Well, you would think so. But the surprises didn't stop there. We did indeed find that about roughly sort of half the sample did look like they were sort of local to West Heslerton. And then we had another half of the population who are associated with the western side of the country. Early East Yorkshire seems to be occupied by a large proportion of Cumbrians, as far as I can tell. You've got a big immigrant component to the West Heslerton population, but not coming from the east, coming from the west.
So the foreign bodies in the cemetery weren't continental warriors, but visitors or economic migrants. The results did not surprise Dominic at all.
There's a small number of newcomers. There are a small number of continental Saxons, Jutes, Frisians and so on and so forth in different parts of the country. But the majority of the population are exactly the same. It's a continuously evolving and cared for landscape. We see Roman sites with Anglo-Saxon components. We see Roman activity underneath the Anglo-Saxon settlement. There is no gap between the two. If there were, then we would have had a huge wodge of that nice red ochre, red sand sitting between the two, and it doesn't happen.
Historians tell us that the Anglo-Saxon invaders came to a society which had been severely weakened by the collapse of Roman rule. But Dominic's vast excavation had found no such evidence.
People are coming to appreciate that the picture that we've thought was genuine for so long is seriously flawed. And our population, we can prove, includes 1 or 2 people that come from Scandinavia. But this isn't an invasion. There is always resistance to change. Because once people are happy with an established understanding, they do not want to change it. It is actually much more exciting to find that it's all wrong.
The people of the 5th century cemetery at West Heslerton looked like newcomers from the continent, and yet most of them were born in Britain. If this change wasn't the result of invasion, what was going on? There were profound cultural changes in the 5th century, and perhaps the most significant was language. There is no doubt that spoken language changed from native British, sometimes called Celtic, to English, which was a descendant of German. Surely this, if anything, has to be proof of the Anglo-Saxon invasion. Modern linguistics, however,
are beginning to question this assumption. Katie Lowe has been looking at the traces of native British grammar in modern English.
It's come down to us that we simply know as a fact that the Celtic languages just didn't really affect modern English. And I think that basically stopped people looking. They just thought, well, there simply can't be any influence at all.
But linguists have discovered a hidden code in our language structure, which shows a strong influence from the Britons.
If you're a Celt and you're trying to learn Old English, just like any second language acquisition, you're going to make mistakes. I mean, if you go to France today, you're bound to make mistakes which really show structure from your own language. So, for example, you might make mistakes in syntax, you might make mistakes in vocabulary. Of course, your accent will be very strange as well. And it's thought that perhaps some of the Celtic structure of the language affected English.
In the process of learning English, the native Britons retained the structure of their own languages, and these ancient patterns are still visible in the grammatical structure of modern English.
Old English was really rather like German in structure, and the way you constructed a sentence was based largely on endings that indicated what a word was doing within a sentence. Nowadays, word order is all important. If I say the cat chased the man, it does not mean the same as the other way round.
In German, word endings and not word order would have told us who was chasing whom. So why did the English language undergo this strange mutation?
We've shifted to a different kind of word order within a sentence. Where's that come from? Because it doesn't seem to have happened quite so much within any of the other Germanic languages. Recent research has shown that the Celtic languages had a part to play in this. There has to be contact. There has to be contact over generations, and there's no other way of doing it.
The rise of English in these islands came not from a tidal wave of invaders, but from a prolonged period of contact during which the native Britons chose to adopt a new way of speaking. But why did this happen? Archaeologist Sam Lucy has been examining graves from the period to understand why this dramatic cultural change took place.
So this would be similar to some of the graves they found at West Heslerton?
Yep, very similar. Up by his head, you've got the metal tip of a spear, and the wooden shaft has rotted away. You've got down over his hip the metal centre of a bigger wooden and leather shield.
Just as the language of the native Britons changed in this period, so too did their style of clothes and weapons.
At the end of the Roman period, a lot of objects that you find changed. Why was that?
I mean, it's traditionally been attributed to Anglo-Saxon migrations or Anglo-Saxon invasions. You do certainly start to get different burial rites. Women tend to get buried with a much greater variety of dress furnishings. This is a brooch type that's known as a cruciform brooch, a cross-shaped brooch. Yeah. And this brooch isn't a continental import. Its idea came ultimately from the continent, but it is a British product. The people living in Britain are perhaps aligning themselves more to a continental style and continental ideas. So I think it's that sort of process that's going on, rather than population replacement, which is what the traditional idea of Anglo-Saxon migrations involves.
The mistake has been to take cultural artefacts as evidence of racial origin.
If I were wearing American jeans, that doesn't make me an American. If I'm driving a German car, that doesn't make me German. It doesn't work like that.
There can be no doubt that a trickle of warriors and families on the move were coming into Britain from the countries of Northern Europe in this period. But the traditional picture of invasion and population replacement is unsustainable. The people of Britain learnt a new language, adopted new fashions, and shifted their political allegiances because they knew from experience that this was the best way to keep up with the rapidly changing times. It was only in later centuries that the complex details of this process were transformed into a captivating story. History books can be dangerous things, especially when they're brilliantly written. In 731, a Tyneside monk named the Venerable Bede finished his ecclesiastical history of the English people, which still forms the basis of modern history lessons. But Bede, like all historians, had his own particular axe to grind. According to Bede, the origins of the church in England lie in 6th century Rome, where Pope Gregory the Great spotted some beautiful fair-haired slaves for sale. Upon being told that they were Angles from the pagan island of Britain, he famously replied that to him they looked more like angels. According to Bede, Gregory immediately makes arrangements for St. Augustine to sail to Britain and convert these heathen creatures to Christianity. To make Augustine's mission more significant than it actually was, Bede portrays Britain as a country populated by heathen unbelievers. He calls these pagans the Anglo-Saxons and describes their conversion as a glorious achievement. In creating this story, Bede gives the church a fresh start in Britain. The newly converted Anglo-Saxon English are depicted as proper Christians, unconnected to the murky Celtic Christianity of the native Britons.
Bede is writing this story 200, 300 years after it happened, so he's trying to present it as a coherent process. Therefore, it's in his interest to make things tidier and more organised, perhaps, than they really were. In fact, Christianity is big by the late Roman period. Augustine arrives in the end of the 6th century. He's already stepping into a country that knew all about Christianity. And when Augustine arrives, by invitation, he finds an island where there are already Christians and bishops and organised church life exists in parts of the island. So there are different streams of Christianity.
The conventional wisdom would have it that the Anglo-Saxons brought with them paganism from abroad, and that Christianity wasn't introduced to England until 597 when St. Augustine arrived in Canterbury. What do you say to that?
I don't believe a word of it. The British Church survived intact, and it was flourishing. The missionaries thought they were coming to barbarian Ruritania. And when they got here, here was a church with its own traditions intact from antiquity. Men who knew how to operate 10 different computational cycles for the reckoning of Easter. They could write classier prose and verse than the Roman missionaries were capable of. So the Roman missionaries found intact a church completely self-possessed. They were so dumbfounded by this that they just blanked it out. They pretended that it had never existed. They pretended that it didn't exist.
In order to gloss over the messy origins of English Christianity, Bede invented a new race of people, the Anglo-Saxons, who came to be known as the English.
Bede has an agenda to present the Anglo-Saxons as a coherent body of people, and they're predestined to inherit southern Britain. Rather like the children of Israel inherit the Holy Land, and they inherit it from the British, according to Bede, because the British are unfit to live here. So the English are a chosen people.
Bede's influence is all the more extraordinary when you realise that he never ventured out of the monastery in Tyneside, where he was brought up.
We know that Bede had particular reasons for writing his history. One of them was really to create a sense of the English. In doing so, he gave us an origin myth.
Do you think that Bede did invent England?
He certainly invented the notion of an English people. What you have to realise is that England doesn't exist before perhaps the 9th, 10th century. It's only later on that you can actually call it a single political nation, if you like. Before this point, you're looking at much smaller, territorially based groupings largely. And so Bede, in writing that ecclesiastical history, is creating that sense of the English, or starting to create that sense.
In telling the story of the Anglo-Saxon invasion, Bede laid the groundwork for an English identity. But I don't believe this version represents who we are as a nation. My journey into the story of Britain AD has uncovered a very different picture of the people of this island. So who are we really? Whether we hark back to Arthur or the Anglo-Saxons, we Brits have always used history to create a national identity for ourselves. The trouble is, these are identities based on a wholly imagined past, so we end up not knowing who we really are. Go to the heart of our democracy, and you see what I mean. When the Victorians decided to decorate the robing room here in the House of Lords, they chose to use the figure of King Arthur. The Victorians had revived the Anglo-Saxon invasion myth with vigour. The invasion identified the noble English as descending from pure Teutonic stock, as distinct from the irrational, undisciplined Celts. In the paintings, King Arthur, a native British warrior from our Dark Age past, had to be made to fit the Anglo-Saxon virtues of the Victorian age. The result was a ludicrous conflation of two very separate aspects of our national identity. British identity just wasn't that simple.
In the 19th century, at the same time that Anglo-Saxon archaeologists, Anglo-Saxon historians are writing the history of the English, you get, if you want to call them that, Celtic historians doing the same for the Welsh and the Irish and the Scottish. And it's actually in direct opposition to each other. They don't happen in a vacuum, they're done in direct consequence of each other. You see very deliberate manipulation of historical sources and archaeology to try to create a sense of history.
The early centuries of Britain AD were formative years in the making of this country's identity.
It is not just the British who are being exercised by their early medieval past. It is the Germans, it is the French. It is right across Europe. If we are now looking to find our roots, who are we? What is our identity? We almost invariably end up in the early Middle Ages, in the immediate post-Roman period, which removed a common culture and created little groups, smaller units, to which we can look and say, this is where I'm coming from. And perhaps you will agree, in my view, what the past is all about is identity.
Our ancestors were not brave Anglo-Saxon supermen, nor mysterious Celtic warriors like Arthur. These origin myths, tying us to one pure race or another, do not do justice to our culture. We were not a weak and disorganized society overpowered by the Romans, nor did we dissolve into chaos when they left. We did not suffer a period of Dark Age confusion, and we never needed to be saved by the tribesmen of Anglo-Saxon legend. The real people of Britain AD did not only survive an influx of foreign influences, but actually flourished because of them. We absorbed Roman and later Byzantine and North European culture without losing a sense of our own identity. It is this ability to absorb and adapt, this creative plagiarism, which has always been at the heart of British identity. And this diversity is not just a feature of our distant past. It's a trait that can still be seen in every aspect of our life. Even our food. Robin Cook, former British Foreign Secretary, famously selected chicken tikka masala as Britain's national dish.
I believe that our national identity itself is a result of a blending of an enormous number of different inputs over the centuries, of different ethnic groups who've come here and settled here, become not so much absorbed, but have made their contribution, become part of the resultant mix, what we now recognize as our own national identity. And I think actually what makes Britain great, what makes us strong, is not purity, it is diversity. It's all those many different influences that have shaped our language, shaped our history, shaped our culture, and shaped our character.
We Britons are striding into the 21st century with all the confidence of our Victorian ancestors. But in planning the way ahead, we must keep an eye on the past. Because if we discard our sense of history, we'll be like people with no memory, who don't know who they are. So to find the true origins of Britain AD, I've had to look beyond the headline-grabbing figures, the Romans, King Arthur and the Anglo-Saxons. And instead, I've turned to the real heroes of these lands, the ordinary Britons in their millions who invented our diverse and resilient culture. One final thought. This could be Indian or China tea, and it says on the packet it was grown in Kenya. Yet despite, or maybe because of these obvious foreign origins, this is still the best-known symbol of Britain.
Thanks again to Incogni for sponsoring this video. Click on the link in the description to find out how you can take your personal data back.